Hi everyone. Welcome to Save the Date, your dating survival guide from Coffee Meets Bagel. I'm Down, your host and CMB's Chief Dating Officer. Each episode, I invite a dating expert to explore what it takes to go on better dates and ultimately find a great relationship. So one of the first things I realized when I started studying the science of dating and relationships is that there are so many dating rules out there that I picked up along the way that are completely BS. So for example, like guys like to chase, so I have to play games. Or if I don't feel chemistry right away, it's never gonna happen. And I got so mad when I found out the actual truth because I had spent so much time and energy trying to abide by these dating rules that really led me astray, like totally misguided me. So I'm really excited to have today's guest, Dr. Gary Lewandowski, to talk about his brand new book, which is coming out on February 9th, next week, Tuesday, ahead of Valentine's Day. It's called Stronger Than You Think. And in this book, he goes through top 10 most common dating myths or blind spots, as he calls it, that could undermine relationships. So we'll talk about how to see past these blind spots so you don't have to learn the hard way like I did and suffer through. And can learn just quickly from Dr. Gary today. Gary's work has been featured by numerous publications, including Time, the New York Times, CNN, and NPR. Plus, his TED Talk on breakups, how to get over a breakup, has been viewed nearly 2 million times. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking.
Yeah, so I was really excited to learn that you decided to tackle this topic of blind spots because I think it could really harm these blind spots can really harm our chance of finding and cultivating a great long-term relationship, which is what all like most CMB daters want. 91% of CMB daters are looking to have long-term relationship. I'm curious, there are so many blind spots out there. How did you distill things to these top 10 things that you decided to include in your book?
Sure. I took the approach I took with pretty much the entire book. And rather than just kind of guessing what I thought the top 10 things were, I went to the research. And the research I used for that particular question was from Samantha Joel. She did a study where they asked people, when you're considering the future of your relationship, basically whether you're going to stay or you're going to go, what do you think about? What do you consider? And so people came up with a ton of reasons. There were 27 reasons to stay, 23 reasons to go. But then when I looked at the top 10 of both of them, there are a lot of common themes, and those themes became the book. What's really interesting about that study, though, is that people had an above average inclination to stay with their current partner, right? And so inertia is powerful. So there's 27 reasons. I generally, I'm skeptical, but I generally want to stay. But those exact same people who were inclined to stay were also had an above average inclination to go. And so it shows just how much conflict there is and turmoil there is. It's really hard to know about the future of your relationship. And so that's where much of this book was born.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And so, I mean, you can understand, I guess, because choosing to be with somebody on the long run, it is a big decision. Probably, you could probably say one of the most important decisions that you actually would end up making in your life and
Absolutely.
has a huge impact on how your life unfolds. So it's natural that we have all these, doubts along the way, moments of questioning. So the study is surprising, but also not surprising if you think about how important this decision is.
Yeah, and to me, actually, what's most surprising is everything you said is true. I mean, relationships are the single most important thing, I think, in our entire life. It's where most of the good times and the bad times come from. Yet, at the same time, never have we paid so little attention to something so important, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to pick a restaurant, we will do extensive research to figure out what the best restaurant is, right? And it's
right.
like, there's so much science of relationships out there. There's so much that scientists know about relationships, yet it's hidden in journals and it's written in a way that's not accessible. And so my mission with this book was to help people have better relationships through science, right? So I took over 350 studies and wrote about them in a way that actually is usable, it's accessible, it makes sense. And so you're going to see a lot of things in these pages about yourself and things that you thought you knew all along that turned out to be wrong.
Yeah, so let's delve in. I'm so excited. So there are 10 blind spots
Okay.
that Gary covers in the book, but because we don't have all, all very important, but we don't have forever. So I picked out a few blind spots that I thought would be really interesting for us to cover on today's show because I get a lot of questions from CMB daters, and based on that, I think these will be the most useful
Mhm.
for the listeners out there. So blind spot number one, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here
Okay.
just to make the conversation interesting. Blind spot number one, men and women are just different, particularly in dating. But isn't this true? Like, don't men just care more about looks and sex, and women care more about, I don't know, education, income, and emotional connection? Isn't this true?
You would think, based on how people act and how people talk about these things, you would believe that that is absolutely true. And when you ask people, are men and women different? So if I were to ask you, who's more likely to say "I love you" first in a heterosexual relationship? Is it men or is it women?
Woman.
Okay. Who's more romantic, men or women?
Woman?
Both men. The research shows
Oh,
both
okay.
the answer to both of those questions is men. Yet it's something like 80% believe that it's women. And
Mm,
now, we also know from separate research that, we're talking about thousands and thousands of participants, that by and large, men and women are much more similar than they're different. It's called the gender similarity hypothesis. There are differences, right? And don't get me wrong. I mean, there are some key differences. Like men like to play video games more and women like to scrapbook more. I mean, that's a real difference. But it just turns out like those real differences aren't real important for relationships. And so by and large, men and women want the same things.
so why is it bad for our relationship or our relationship possibility to kind of believe that men and women are just different?
It's the perfect question, right? Because this isn't just one of those like, oh, isn't it adorable you think men and women are different? I mean, there's very serious implications for your relationship. The first is it sets up something I call the tyranny of low expectations, right? If
Mm,
you're in a relationship with a man and you have stereotypical beliefs about men and how they act in relationships in terms of their inability to communicate, they're not very emotional, they're not making connections, and your partner is acting in those ways, which we know for the record is bad for relationships, but you
mm-hmm,
believe all men are like that, what's the point of trading in this bad guy for
mm,
another guy? Because all guys are the same. And so this is just how guys are. So you
mm,
start accepting more of these bad behaviors just because you think, well, they're all like this, right?
right,
The other real downside is that you can't change easily the sex of your partner, right? And
right.
so if you're just saying like, oh, men are always like this, or girls will be girls, and they're always going to be this way, there's no hope, absolutely no hope. But when you look at the research and look at really what's behind some of these male female sex differences, what you realize is it's power differentials. The great news about power differentials is we can change those. And so most of those power differentials traditionally favor men. And so you get men acting like men, but it's really because they have more power. And so if you have some of these problems, you can equate the power better. And then, a lot of the problems you have with the male female differences will go away.
Could you elaborate on what it means when you have, say, men have more power, and that's what actually is underlying this, I guess, like a phenomenon?
Sure. So power has to do with who's making decisions in the relationship, who gets to have their way more, and just traditionally, men are filling that role. And
Mm,
so there's something we call the principle of lesser interest. So the person who has less interest or less need for the relationship has more power, right? So if you have less interest in the relationship, you're more willing and able to say, you know what, if you're not going to do the kinds of things I want you to do, then I'm willing to leave. That's the person that has less interest. And traditionally, that has been the man. Stereotypically, we believe women need relationships more, and so women are less likely to fulfill that higher power role in relationships.
okay, and how does it show up in the in re relationship?
So the person that has more power can do things like be more standoffish. They're less attentive to their partners, for example, nonverbal cues, right? So we know traditionally women are much better at reading, at communicating, right, and reading nonverbal cues. They pick up on their partner's moods and things like that. And we think, oh, well, women are just better at that than men. and men just aren't very good at communicating and picking up on nonverbals. But a study showed that when you incentivize men, right? If you tell men it's a competition and they're going to get paid if they're good at this, all of a sudden now men are much better at reading nonverbals. Now, that's a power differential because when you have high power, imagine you're the boss. You don't have to spend a ton of time kind of monitoring the emotions of everyone that works for you and your employees because their moods don't affect you that much. But if you're working, you're an employee, you do have to pay attention to the people around you that have more power because their moods do impact you. And so this attentiveness and this ability to communicate and read these nonverbal signals is less about being a female and more about having less power and needing to be more attentive to those that have high power.
I see. So I think if I were to I think what I'm hearing is that some of the behaviors that people commonly attribute to man or woman isn't really about gender. It really is about the power difference. And so, in cases where women have more power, you're probably going to observe the same kind of behavior, like paying less attention and whatever else in that relationship, regardless of people's gender. It's
Exactly.
what I'm hearing. Okay.
Exactly. Here's an even better example. In dating, speed dating events, we always think of men as being less selective, right? Like that men are kind of more willing to kind of take like shotgun approach and are willing to say yes to date a lot of people. And you see that in a traditional speed dating event where women are sitting in one spot and men are circulating around. At those events, men are much more likely to say yes to more of the women who are in seating positions. There's a variation on that general approach where instead of having women seating in one spot, they had the women circulate around and they had the men sit in one spot. So what happened then is it was the women this time who were less selective. So really it had a lot more to do with your role than it had to do with whether you were male or female. So it wasn't that men were always, non-selective in taking that shotgun approach. It just turned out that whoever was circulating wasn't very picky. The people who were sitting and had partners coming to them, you're in a position of power, so you get to be a little bit more picky.
I see. Yeah, and I want to bring the conversation back to what you mentioned in the beginning. Why does this matter? Why is it harmful for us to actually have these gender stereotypes and not actually focus on who the person that you're dating is? I think not only do we actually end up accepting, oh, okay, well, I guess it's just going to be the case, which is absolutely not true. And also, I think a lot of times we end up boxing ourselves to behave in a certain way that is not authentic to us if we actually hold on to this gender stereotypes about ourselves or our partner. So for example, I know this was my case for me for a fairly long time, because of the stereotype of men like to play games, they like to chase. So I know for myself, when I was dating in my 20s, even though I was really interested in somebody, I wanted to ask for their phone number or whatever else, I kind of just held back because I was under the impression that guys like to chase. And if I actually do something, I'm making myself too available. And I know there are tons of like my other girlfriends who actually engage in the same behavior because of this gender stereotyping. And then it turns out, like, my latest partner, in my 30s now, I'm like, I think I'm too old for this. So,
You're tired.
yeah. And, my partner is somebody who's he just is not the type of person who's going to initiate. He's very shy. And after our first date, he never, I mentioned this a couple of times on the show, he never reached out and I never heard from him. And, there was one point I was going to not do anything. Again, going back to this gender stereotype. But I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna ask and express what I want, which is, hey, I really enjoyed our time together, and I would love to see you again. Which is what I did, and we're, a few years later, we're still happily together. And so, I think just believing certain things to be true based on our category, whether it's gender or ethnicity or whatever else, can really harm us that way. This is one example. It's really important to kind of consider, yes, statistic is statistics, but we are not numbers, right? And the way individual manifests ourselves, we're not numbers. And so just being a lot more attentive to who you really are and who they really are beyond all these categories, I think can be really helpful to our dating life.
Yeah, and, it's one of those situations where you don't know when you're following a rule like that if it's actual fact or just well-intended, story, right? And so, as much as you hear like the hard to get thing, you know what we like more than anything else is someone who has the good taste to like us, right? And
Right.
so, if you're acting like you don't like me, that's kind of off-putting in a lot of ways. And, playing games early in a relationship is setting up your relationship long term to play games. And so, is that really the foundation you want to build for your relationship? And science suggests that it's not a good idea, as you've discovered.
Right. Great. So let's move on to blind spot number two in your book, which is I can't be attracted to someone who isn't gorgeous and successful. AKA, and this was my slight different interpretation. If I don't feel attracted to someone right away because they're not gorgeous and successful, I'll not be attracted to them later. Isn't that true?
No, no. I mean, people can grow on you in a lot of ways, and some of my own research that I've done shows that personality goes a long way, and so that you can see somebody, and then when you learn really great things about their personality, you find out they're funny, they're intelligent, they're witty and charming, and all those types of things. You actually come to see them as more attractive. So in a lot of ways, we put way too much emphasis on attraction, and really it's silly because in a lot of ways, it's a dying industry, right? You reach a certain point in your life, and chances are from that point forward, your physical features are deteriorating, right? You're getting less and less attractive over time. And so if you're really banking on that aspect of your partner, you're putting a lot of faith in something that's not likely sustainable.
Hmm. Let's. I love some of the research that you mentioned on the book on this point,
Hmm.
and let's delve into that because it's nice to believe. We all want to believe. I think to a certain extent, we know that just focusing on looks is kind of superficial, and we
Hmm.
want to
Hmm.
believe that like we're seeing beyond that and
Hmm.
personality, and that has an impact. But I think some of us actually don't know the science. Like this actually is true, and so there's some research that you mentioned in the book about length of their friendship, length of couples' friendship and
Hmm.
attractiveness difference, and also, how men rate photo differently. Could you talk specifically about those research?
Yeah, I mean, so that first study you're talking about discusses how much emphasis we place on physical attractiveness depending on how long we've known somebody. And so it turns out that if you've only known somebody a short period of time, you tend to emphasize physical features more, right? Because physical things, it's the one thing we can know about a partner when we don't really know much at all. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we use those physical features to kind of play armchair psychologist and try to read in other things. So
Yeah,
we,
and
we
that's like the most visible information that we get as soon as we see somebody, right? So it's very human nature to interpret a lot of information from based on what we see, because that's the first thing that we actually gather.
Absolutely, and it's like you said, we can't help it. It happens in milliseconds, right? And this is why dating profiles without pictures aren't very popular because we like that information, and it's just something we're so accustomed to. But for folks that had known each other for a longer period of time before they started romantic relationships, and they had been acquaintances or friends of some sort, they were less matched in terms of their physical attractiveness. And then that's important because what it meant was rather than relying on physical features as the foundation of their relationship, they relied on other things. And we know those other things are much more important. They relied on, how similar we are in terms of personality, how well we get along, how well we like the same things. And we know that those things are important.
Mm. What about the second study?
The second one, I think you mentioned about men looking at pictures differently. And men are, if there's one of those differences that are out there, men care about physical appearance more, right? And one of the things that research has found is that men are looking for partners who are on average 25% more attractive than they are.
Mm.
And so that sounds, like who doesn't want an upgrade, right? Like who doesn't want to have kind of the best of the best in a way. But we also know that if you and your partner are mismatched, right? If you're kind of shopping out of your price range, or you're going out of your league, it actually makes your relationship less stable. So men are looking at pictures and looking for these physical features and these super hot partners. But then once they get them, ironically, it's not making the relationship better. It actually makes the relationship worse. And so there's no benefit to relationships that we can find to having a super attractive partner, but there are downsides. And so that partner of yours, if you're a guy and you have a female partner who's much more attractive than you, you're more worried about her leaving you. There's more jealousy. There's more sort of manipulative types of behaviors and controlling types of behaviors. You have a lot more to worry about now. And we just know that matched partners are much more stable.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting study. The study that I was thinking about is the one where you actually had, or you or someone, the researcher had men rate photos of women on how attractive they are initially, and then they were asked to do some activity that were distracting, and then they came back, and then this time they actually learned about some personality attributes of a woman whose these photos belong to. And then after these men learned about the personality of this woman, their attractiveness score that they gave to each photo actually changed.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the study I mentioned a little bit earlier that I'd done, where you show somebody a photo, then they get to learn some traits about them, and when they learn things about their intelligence and their sense of humor, and what a good person they are, it actually makes that photo look more physically attractive. The interesting thing with that study too is it goes the opposite way. So you could see somebody who's very physically attractive, but then as you learn things about them, that they're materialistic, they're vain, they're annoying, they actually become less physically attractive too. So personality, we don't give it nearly as much credit as we should, particularly for long-term relationships, but it's immensely important.
Yeah, and I think what this study clearly shows that your level of attraction and even physical attraction will change, for sure, will change over time as you get to know them. And I think this is something that is very important to remember, especially now because of the prevalence of online dating apps, right? And like you mentioned, the less we know about people, the more stock we are actually going to give to physical appearance, because that's pretty much the only thing that we know. And I think it's very easy to fall in the trap of, like, we show up for a first date. I mean, we don't really know them that well at this point, and based on how physically attracted that I am to this person, it's very easy to dismiss or continue wanting to see this person. And I think that could actually make us, especially initially when we really don't really know that person, make us not make the most optimal decision when it comes to dating.
Yeah, and then, there's research that shows exactly that, is that if you ask people before they meet partners, what are you looking for in a partner? People have some pretty clear ideas of what they want. But then once you launch them into that real life dating market, their plans go out the window, and they basically start just defaulting to the emotional side of things, the physical side of things, and which is not, it's human nature in a way, but it's a real shame, because that's actually not what's helpful.
Yeah, so one of the advice that I like to give out to CME daters is, when you go on a first date, unless it's like an absolute no, like hell no, like this isn't going to work out, actually go on second, or at least like second or third date, because again, even the level of attraction, never mind the personality, like how you feel about the physical attractiveness of that person is going to change as you get to know them. So whatever impression that you had will change.
Absolutely.
Great. Let's move on to blind spot number 3. If we're not having a lot of sex, we're not in love. Isn't that true?
Oh, we think it is. I mean, it's so easy to think that, because so many times in relationships, when we start off in a relationship, we're super in love, right? And that's also when we're having a lot of sex, right? So those two things are highly correlated early on. So we think that correlation kind of holds for the rest of our relationship. And what research finds over and over and over again is it doesn't. The two are really unrelated. And so how much the frequency with which you and your partner have sex is really not related to your relationship satisfaction. And this has been found immediately among newlyweds. It's been found 4 years later. I mean, it's a very, very consistent finding, because it's quality, not quantity, that matters. And in fact, it's in worse relationships where couples start having more sex. So when marriages and long-term relationships start getting shaky, they start emphasizing sex more. Now, men will pursue sex more when they feel confident and secure in their relationship and are very much in love. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to pursue sex, at least according to one study, when they felt less in love. And so rather than more sex being this great sign, in many ways, it's a warning sign of like, wait, why are we emphasizing this? Because in a longer term relationship, it becomes less and less about the amount of sex that you're having and much more about some of the other things that go into relationships.
Yeah, and you mentioned this concept of sexual growth versus sexual destiny belief,
Hmm.
which I thought was really interesting and important to cover. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. When you asked earlier about, can people get more attractive over time? I was hoping we were going to come back to this. I was kind of saving this one. Um, it turns out, we kind of have this idea sometimes where it's like, there's going to be this spark, there's going to be this chemistry, or there's not. We look at it as an either or thing. And that's that's folks, we call them in the research destiny believers, right? They're
Mm.
like, it's either going to happen or it's not. They have a lot more trouble with finding partners because they're looking for these clear cut signs of is it good or is it bad, right? The other folks, though, are growth. I mean, they have this growth mindset, which you're probably familiar with. And they take this perspective where, okay, the first time we have sex, it's going to be okay, but it doesn't have to be the world's best thing I've ever had as a clear cut sign that we're meant to be. But over time, we're going to learn more and more about each other, and we're going to get better and better at this. And so it's not how you start, it's more about how you finish.
Yeah. And so for those of us out there, we're starting to date, I don't know, maybe, in the very beginning, especially like sex wasn't great. Like Gary said, it's not, okay, so sex wasn't great, so then this is doomed to fail kind of thing. It can change over time. And as long as like both parties like put effort into it, it could get better over time. So it's probably not the correct judgment in the very beginning to just kind of dismiss, okay, the sex wasn't great, so this isn't going to
Mhm.
go anywhere.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
oftentimes the sex you have early on is some of the worst sex you have because you don't know your way around. Right? It's like
Right.
the first time you visit a city, you're not always guaranteed to find all the best spots, but after you know the city better, you start knowing your way around a little bit better, and it's more enjoyable.
Right. And sex, one thing I want to actually go back to on this topic, because I think there is a lot of, we talked about gender stereotyping in the
Hmm.
very beginning. I think sex is actually one of those areas where there's really like a very entrenched gender stereotyping where, we just kind of believe that men just care more about sex. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
I know that there are a lot of people out there who men feel pressured even if they don't
Hmm.
actually want to bring up
Hmm.
sex, and then women just get really nervous when like sex isn't brought up, or they're the guys don't initiate sex because they kind of take that as like, okay, well, men care a lot about sex, so maybe that they're not interested in something.
Hmm.
Could you kind of talk about that? Because I think that yeah, it's just like a lot of stereotyping involved with sex.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to the same fundamental misbelief that sex is so much a part of how relationships work or don't work. And so then you start adding on top of that this other blind spot of that men and women are so different. Now you're really combining a bunch of things at once, which makes it all worse. As you kind of pointed out, sex is not entirely a male dominated experience, right? Or it shouldn't be. And so men and women, the research showed that level of interest in sex is the same, right? And so by believing that there's differences, we know differences create distance. And if you're believing that there are these differences, you're going to create this artificial distance. And we also know that there's, when we look at things in terms of men and women, we're leaving a lot of information out. It's much better to look at underlying psychological traits. And there's actually an underlying psychological trait that helps explain what we think are male female differences. And it's something called sociosexuality. Sociosexuality has to do with how much you see love and sex as being separate or one and the same. And so if you see them as one and the same, in order to have an enjoyable sexual experience, you have to be in love with that person. But if you see them as separate, you can be in love with somebody or you can have sex with somebody, and though you can find both enjoyable. And so what we find is it's not a male female thing as much as it's if someone sees love and sex as different, they act male like, or at least how we've
Mm.
stereotyped male behavior. And so there was actually a study on looking at Tinder and how much people are using Tinder to look for someone to cheat with. And we'll often ask this in class, like so who's more likely to do that? And people say, oh, it's definitely guys. I was like, nope, wasn't guys or girls. It was the people that saw sex and love, the social sexuality as separate. And so when you start uncovering and understanding some of those types of things, now you can explain your own behavior more. and you can understand yourself more and really try to understand. And this is something I do in the book, is I give people a chance to fill out scales, little measures to kind of learn these things. Like, so if you're wondering, like, where are you in terms of sociosexuality, there's a brief little measure in there to kind of help people figure this out, to learn a little bit more about themselves.
Fascinating. All right, so last blind spot that we're going to cover. If we break up, I'll be broken. Isn't this also true? I'll be broken for sure, right? At least for a little bit.
Um, I wouldn't say any breakup is a purely good experience, but I also wouldn't say it's always a purely bad experience either. Human experiences are just so complicated. Nothing's 100%, right? So there's so many experiences in our life, and you think about it, the day you graduate college or high school, there's a mix of emotions, right? Even the day you get married, mix of emotions. And breakups, no different. The issue with breakup, and why it's one of these blind spots that's troubling, is that when people think that their breakup is going to leave them broken, they put it off. We procrastinate, right? We don't want to go to the dentist because it might hurt. We don't want to break up our relationship because it might hurt. The problem is it keeps us in relationships longer than we should, particularly ones that aren't very fulfilling, right? So if our relationship's not helping us become a better person, leaving it should. And the problem is we're wrong about this. So, researchers did something that only researchers could really do, is they took a bunch of people in relationships and they asked them, who are happily in relationships, by the way, and they asked them, if this relationship ended, how devastated would you be? How much would it hurt? People were like, oh my gosh, it's going to be horrible, right? Then the researchers, right, they followed up. We need data. We need to verify to see what actually happened. When they followed people, what they found was people weren't as devastated as they had predicted. And so we're often mistaken. Now, it's not saying that these people said, you know what, I thought I was going to be devastated. This is the world's best experience. They're not saying that, right? But they're just not nearly as devastated as they thought they'd be, which is important because it helps us get out of the relationships we should, so we can get into the ones that we need to be in.
Right. There were some coping strategies that you mentioned on the in the book for those of us who are actually going through breakups.
Mhm.
There are some exercises that you asked them to do that really help them with this process. Could you talk about a few?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I talk a lot about in my TED Talk as well. One of the big ones is don't get back together, right? So we have this inclination like, oh my gosh, I'm not with them, I hurt. Well, if I'm back with them, I won't hurt as much. And what we know from that is that's not true. It might be a temporary fix, but it actually prolongs the pain for a longer period of time, which isn't good. One of the things that I talk about in the TED Talk is this idea of rediscovery of the self. And so what we know is when you experience a breakup, particularly one that hurts, is you actually lose a part of yourself, because you and your partner, your senses of self have been enmeshed. And so when your partner leaves, they take part of yourself with them. And so you kind of need to fill in that space with something. And there's a lot of possibilities you could pick. But what we know is if you pick something that you liked already, in particularly something that the relationship held you back from or prevented you from doing, that's rediscovery of the self. You're basically rediscovering some things about yourself that you had minimized or sacrificed for the good of the relationship. We know that you pursue those activities, you're much better off and your coping is much greater. Another strategy that we've used in some of the research I've done is writing about the breakup. So often we think of breakups again as like this experience that's going to break us. But what we had people do is some people wrote about the negatives, some people wrote about an unrelated activity, but then this other group, the key group, we had them write about all of the ways the breakup was good. And that's important because it gets people out of these mental ruts, right? They're kind of going down these like emotional cul-de-sacs where they can only see their breakup one way and it's this horrible experience. But you kind of say like, no, okay, you must focus on what were the good things? What can you do now that you couldn't do before? What are the good things you're feeling? And what we found, not surprisingly to us, was that was very helpful to folks. They were able, again, because no experience is 100% awful or good. So even in your breakup, which might be 80% horrible, there's still a 20% that there's some good stuff in there. And so a lot of times we take the good for granted and we overlook and underappreciate the good parts in our actual relationship and in all these relationship experiences. And so the idea was to force people to pay attention to those things. And the participants found it very helpful.
Yeah, I love that. And one other thing that you mentioned is, don't try to understand why. Like, I think we have a tendency of when there's a breakup, of course, it's a big event, so we think about it a lot. And there's a tendency for us to go down the path of, especially if you weren't the person who initiated it, why did this happen, right? But really, there's no solution or answer to that, and so it's just gonna take you into the rabbit hole. If you want to take some time to think about breakup, I think what you're suggesting is a much better use of our time and productive, which is let's think about what good is coming out of this breakup and this experience.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I get asked a lot is uh, when I'm dating somebody, and most CM daters are in the early stage of dating, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes it's hard to tell if I should break up with
Hmm.
this person, or if I'm being too picky. Like, I
Hmm.
think some of us go back and forth, trying to kind of figure that out. Is there any clear framework or set of questions that we could ask to have a more clear answer to and have more conviction around our decision to whether to continue or break up?
If only it were that simple, right? It's like, relationships are complicated, and so any simple solution is going to be an oversimplification most of the time. But what I tell my students all the time, who've taken my relationships course, is better data leads to better decisions. And so really the best possible thing you can do is do as much as you can to become more informed about a lot of the relationship processes. So a lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, you're a relationship scientist. Your relationship must be amazing." And in some ways it is. Like, I mean, I've been married 20 years, so that's a good sign. Um, but the thing that benefits me is that I know enough about the relationships to know what to look, all of the things to look for and to emphasize, and all the things that just aren't as important, and things to ignore. And so, there's probably not a clear cut single thing, but if I had to pick one, particularly as you said, if people are dating early on, the mistake that most people make is they focus too much on the rewards and all the good things that they're feeling,
Mm,
right? So early in a relationship, whether that relationship is going to turn out good or bad, early on, they're indistinguishable in terms of how many rewards there are, because new relationships are rewarding. That's they're fun, they're new, they're interesting. That's all this great stuff. Um, but that's what we focus on. We're like, oh my gosh, I love all these new, and we ignore the important things, which are the costs. Now, early on, a relationship that you're just getting to know somebody should have very little cost. You guys shouldn't be experiencing much conflict. There shouldn't be a bunch of power struggles. There should be these like differences of opinion and the awkwardness and things like that. What we end up doing though is we put too much emphasis on looks and
mm,
passionate love and sex, which encourage us to overlook all those small things. Like, oh, that'll get better on its own. It won't.
mhm,
We know that people that get divorced, you say, where did these problems come from? They by and large say, well, these problems have been here all along. I
mm,
just ignored them and they got worse. And
mm,
so, focusing on costs early on, set aside the rewards, take those, that's a time, everyone should have those. That's a given. But like, how much friction is there? How much trouble are you having? Because you should really start off way up here, and then over time life gets in the way, and then things get more complicated. But you shouldn't start off with a whole lot of cost and problems.
mm, mm. Yeah, great advice. And I think one other thing that I would add is that for more data is good, right? So if you're unsure, then you could continue to kind of collect data. I think having really clear understanding of your absolute needs, and making sure that you have that, and not letting things like looks and sex and whatever else that we know we have a tendency to emphasize as a human being, as a
Mm-hmm.
human
Mm-hmm.
nature.
Mm-hmm.
Just making sure that we have clarity on that, I think can be really helpful. And just staying true that, and knowing that you have this inertia to kind of
Mm-hmm.
like what you mentioned, emphasize certain things that kind of don't matter in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. I wish we had
Sure.
more time to explore more all the blind spots that in your book. Guys, if you on February 9th when the book comes out, please go and read it so that you can explore and learn more about the rest of the blind spots that Gary mentions in the book. It'll be really, really helpful to our dating lives. So for every show, ahead of the show, we collect some questions that people
Okay.
want to ask you. I have some interesting ones here. First question, what are some ways to figure out the other person's stance on who pays for the date without seeming cheap?
you, it's easy, and you're not going to like this answer, but ask, right? Have a conversation, right? I mean, there's so many things that we're afraid to talk about, but relationships and the success of relationships require and rely on open communication. So you don't have to make it awkward, like, wait, are you paying for this or am I? That's not how you would bring it up. You'd be like, so just acknowledge the awkward, hey, in this situation, what are your views on how this goes? Because, and talk about, the different possibilities and your thoughts behind it. Just open, honest communication. It sets a really nice foundation for open, honest communication going forward.
Yeah, great. I cannot agree with you more. I think one of the tips that I also give out, one time we had a lady named Jenna Card, who is a nonviolent communication facilitator, come and talk about how do we actually ask these awkward questions. And one of the things that she mentioned, which actually helped me a lot, is just kind of self-connect and be in tune with the reason why you actually want to ask this question. And share that first before you ask. If you're because sometimes if we just ask the question, like, then they could be kind of misunderstanding, like this person is worried, like, okay, is this person asking this because they want to be cheap or something? But if you actually explain where you're coming from first, there's not going to be such misunderstanding. So for example, if you're wanting to pay, I don't know what the intention behind this question, wanting to know this is, but for me, hypothetically, if it's, well, I want to pay, but I also want to be respectful about, maybe this is important to them that, we pay equally or whatever, then you could say that, hey, like, I want to, check comes, hey, I want to pay, but I also want to be respectful of whatever if you have a strong opinion on who should pay on the first date. So I wanted to ask you. And so if there's some, like, that kind of explanation, as to why you're asking, then of course the person is not going to assume that you're asking this because you're cheap.
Well, and they also won't take it personally, right? If someone's asking that kind of thing, automatically as the receiver of that question, you start going through all this stuff like, why are they asking me this? Is there something I did? Is there some vibe I'm giving off? Like, is it a look? Do I look cheap? Like, we get really egocentric and we have this like spotlight effect on ourselves. And so if you explain yourself and put it in that context, you take the burden off of that other person from going through all of that, because they'll get this look like, uh-oh. and if you, to the extent you can avoid that, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, second question. Is double texting necessary? And here by double texting, I think this person means I texted something and then maybe they didn't get a response. So then I like text again?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's important to you, double text, but maybe not 3.
Yeah, and I think thing about texting that I emphasize is that it's a mode of communication that can leave us to interpret things in many, many different ways, right? And you're not there to explain. It's very easy for any kind of misunderstanding to happen. I mean, we're all busy. Maybe this person didn't see the message. Maybe they were in the middle of something and they meant to reply, but they forgot. Right. You just don't know. And so I agree with you. By all means, text again to, hey, like, I just wanted to make sure that you saw this or whatever. Because you can never be sure, especially in this day and age when everybody's kind of like multitasking and there's so many texting flying back and forth.
Yeah, and generally in life, I think you end up regretting the things you didn't do, not the things that you did, right? Yeah. And so if you don't send that second text, you're always going to wonder, like, what if I sent that second text? I should have sent that second. Why didn't I send that second text, right? And then you're just going to kind of end up going down that path.
Yeah.
So, what's the worst that could happen? They don't text back. They're already not texting back.
Right. Right. And they're not going to think, I mean, hey, just confirming you got this text. I mean, that is not they're not going to think that, oh my God, like, why is this person obsessed with me or something like that.
Right. Don't make your second text, where are you? I need to see you right now. Like, that's, you got to kind of walk the line a little bit.
But I also liked your advice, which is like, after that, if then you don't hear back, sometimes you got to draw the line somewhere.
Right.
All right. Single mothers get slim pickings when starting to date again. Myth?
No, unfortunately not. I think it's difficult. As you get older in dating, that becomes less true because, as there's more single dads, we gravitate towards similarity. So, as soon as you're a single parent, now it becomes harder to date people who are not parents. And so you're just it's for moms and for dads as well, I believe. So, you're drawing from a smaller pool because, again, similarity becomes so important.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention, it's like slim picking, I mean, it's kind of relative, right? Like it's like slimmer or the pool is smaller, it could be smaller than,
Yes.
right? And it's not, I appreciate that you mentioned single dad as well. And I actually think it's not even just about like single mom, single dad. Like if we have more criteria that we bring onto dating,
Mm-hmm.
the dating pool is going to get smaller, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
say, if you're a single mom, I would think that you have to date somebody who is wants children or is fond of children, right? So that is a
Like, right.
criteria, right?
Right.
Criteria that you're bringing on. So if you versus somebody who didn't have the criteria, well, their pool is going to be larger. And
Sure.
so in that way, you could say it's a slimmer picking. And the advice that I would give to this person who is a single mom, I'm assuming a single mom, is that I mean, of course, there's still plenty of people out there who
Mm-hmm.
are open to dating single moms and dads. Just be very mindful about what other criteria you would be bringing to the table. If you are, criteria is like, okay, I'm fond of children and I have like this 10 other criteria that I have. Well, yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult to meet somebody who meet all the 10 criteria. And so be very mindful of what other needs, like the absolute criteria you're putting on. The less we have of that, it's just statistics, right? The
Mm-hmm.
less we have of that, the larger the pool that we have, and easier it's going to be for us to meet somebody who meet that criteria.
Yeah, and I think you put it very well. It's not slim, it's just slimmer. And
Right.
as it gets slimmer, the other thing it also gets is more specific to what you're looking for. And so that's not always a bad thing in and of itself as well. Some of those other things that go along with, kids, you got to start finding out about the person's parenting style, the parenting beliefs. Maybe their smoking habits and drinking habits become different. And so it's as you point out, it might just be kids or not, but then you're also kind of superimposing a bunch of extra criteria on top of that because you're also thinking about how these potential partners are going to impact your kid,
Mm-hmm.
as you
Mm-hmm.
should.
Right. Absolutely. Very important. All right. Thank you so much, Gary, for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Final question I ask every Save a Date guest: what is the best dating advice you've ever received?
You should date your best friend, right? And
Mm,
so often, it goes back to some of these things we were talking about in terms of physical attractiveness and emphasizing looks and sex and all that kind of thing. The thing that actually keeps relationships going strong is whether you get along with your partner. It's whether your partner's your best friend. There's a study that looked at expert couples, and these are couples who are happily married for 15 years or more. And they said, what's your number one piece of advice? Like, what's this one thing that keeps you going strong? And they said, number one, partner is my best friend. Number two is I like my partner as a person. And so if you're looking at relationships and you're interested in the long haul, that friendship, someone you enjoy spending time with, that you care about, sense of humor, takes care of you, right? That person that you can spend the last 8 or 9 months in quarantine with and enjoy spending time together, that's super, super important. And I think now more than ever, as we deal with COVID and all this extra time spending together, that does your partner pass the best friend test?
hmm
And if they do, you're in really good shape. If they don't, you have something very clear to work on. And so that's going to help keep your relationship going strong.
Great advice, guys. Gary's new book, Stronger Than You Think, is hitting the stores on February 9th. So please go and read it. If they want to keep in touch with you, learn more about your work, where do they go,
Right
Gary?
now, the best place is Twitter. So I'm at Lewandowski, PhD. And then my website, www.garylewandowski.com.
All right. Thank you, Gary, once again. And everyone, thanks for joining. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.